I started a new career at 34, already feeling the relentless gaze of society, which for some reason thought that women over 30 should scale back their dreams and desires, especially when it comes to their careers. It all started with one disparaging comment from my former boss, a phrase said hastily, as if it were something insignificant. "You'd better think about your family, not about new starts. You're not 20, after all." And although he said it in a low voice, by the way, this phrase dug into my soul like an icy splinter, and burned from the inside with shame and determination at the same time. That day I left not just my job, I left the feeling of my insignificance. And already in a new place, where abilities were valued more than age or gender, where no one squinted at my passport, I felt that I could breathe deeply again. My husband, he was the first to see in me not just a woman who had crossed the third dozen, but a person, resilient, talented, with pain and history behind her. He believed in me, even before I had time to believe in myself. His support was like a quiet, warm rain after a long drought, unobtrusive, but healing. And then, as it happens when hearts find each other without unnecessary preludes, everything happened quickly: a proposal, a wedding, new keys to a common house. And now I am sitting on the floor of the nursery, drawing the sun on the wall and understanding that we now have a daughter, our fourth grader with big, thoughtful eyes, with a book in her hands and with a soul that could be compared to a transparent spring stream, if I knew of at least one stream capable of so tenderly caring for others. But, as often happens, happiness was not cloudless. My relationship with my husband's sister was strained from the very beginning. That's probably the most accurate word. I got along with the rest of the relatives, sincerely tried to become part of their family, cooked for the holidays, called without reason, but she seemed to keep me at a distance, like a stranger, like a threat. I felt that she didn't like that I was older than her brother, although she never said it out loud, at least at first. But then those very jokes began that leave traces. First, innocent, in her opinion, comments about our hasty marriage, then caustic smirks about my age, then ridicule about my body, changed by pregnancy. Every word she said hit the most vulnerable spot. I tried not to react, even smiled in response, because I knew that if I gave in, it would destroy my fragile peace. But the pain remained. It wasn't open hostility, no, more like a thin, viscous veil of disdain and veiled malice. The only thing that changed the situation was her own sudden wedding and departure. She quickly arranged everything and disappeared, as if someone had flicked a switch and the house became a shade brighter. We stopped seeing each other, and I could finally breathe freely, without fear of injections and poisonous words. I focused on the most important thing: welcoming our daughter into this world. The pregnancy was not easy, the birth was difficult, but it was in that sterile white room, filled with screams and tears, that I felt how everything bad that had come before dissolved in the moment when she appeared. Both of us, me and my husband, cried, and in those tears there was no pain, only gratitude. When she first cried and he squeezed my hand and whispered, "You are stronger than I have ever known," I knew that everything we had been through was worth that moment. And before we continue, write in the comments from which city you are watching this video. Enjoy watching. But the idyll did not last long. Only 5 months passed, and my husband's sister, now my mother, returned to our home. She had given birth to a boy, and it would seem that motherhood should have softened her, made her more understanding. But her visits became recurring. Hour after hour she sat in our living room, holding her baby, throwing caustic comparisons between him and our daughter. She hinted that my maturity had influenced genetics, claimed that the wrinkles on the child's face were the result of my age, while her son was the standard of infant beauty. I tried not to show how much it affected me, but when she started showing up with nothing at all, no diapers, no bottles, empty-handed, and leaving with our supplies, saying she was out of everything at home and would just borrow, something broke inside me. It wasn't about caring for a child, it was about showing off, about asserting her superiority. But fortunately, her husband's job required a move again, to another state, and the visit stopped. The move became a respite, a brief but precious period of peace and restoration. We could be a family again without poison in our teaspoons. Everything went smoothly until our daughter started elementary school. Then one day she came home, her eyes shining, and excitedly announced, "Mom, my cousin is now in my school." I froze, My heart ached, but I smiled, for her sake, for her trust. And no matter how complicated adult relationships are, children, as it turned out, know how to connect hearts. They became close, became true friends. My daughter is a little older, caring, attentive, as if the ability to be a support lived in her from birth. He reached out to her, laughed next to her, and she told him about books, shared lunch, held his hand during breaks. By the 3rd grade, they were in the same class. And then my daughter, inspired by summer evenings with a book under the blanket and our conversations in the kitchen, presented a reading project that was admired not only by teachers, but also by the local newspaper. Her thoughts, so mature and sincere, were printed on a whole page. This achievement, unexpected and wonderful, became a reason for sincere pride and joy in our family. It was discussed in the living room over a cup of tea, in telephone conversations with relatives, on the school playground with other parents, as if the recognition in the local newspaper itself turned into something more than just a publication, into a symbol of the efforts, kindness, and intelligence of our daughter. When we went to visit my relatives to celebrate this event, the house was filled with laughter, the smell of freshly baked goods and a muffled hum of voices, because quite a few people had gathered, and it seemed to me that many of them really came not just out of family obligations, but to express respect and support for our family, and most importantly, our daughter. However, against the background of this benevolent and touching attention, I increasingly caught the cold gaze of my daughter-in-law, who seemed to be literally suffocating with irritation and jealousy. She openly complained that all this excitement was unfair, because, according to her, it was her son who should have been the hero of the school reading, all because of the very book that, according to her version, he chose first. I tried to calmly explain that the children had exchanged books of their own free will, and that they had both read both versions, discussed, argued, and decided together which book would be the focus of the report. I saw them sitting on the carpet in our living room, bending over the covers, arguing and laughing like adults who have nothing to share. The spirit of cooperation between them was so sincere that I admired them. My nephew himself, when I carefully mentioned it, confirmed that yes, he preferred the book that my daughter read first, and yes, she had offered him to choose it because he liked it too, and because it was more important to her that he felt important. When I shared this story with other adults, hoping to emphasize the importance of good relationships between children, my sister-in-law's face immediately changed and, barely containing her irritation, accused me of writing the reflections instead of my daughter. I was shocked. Yes, I had once been an ardent writer in college, writing short stories, even starting a novel, but it had been so long ago that it now lived somewhere deep inside me, like an old book on a dusty shelf. Apparently my husband had mentioned it in one of those family conversations where you share your youthful passions over a bowl of soup, not thinking that anyone would turn it into a weapon. She went further, hinting to other parents at school that I had allegedly used some personal connections with the contest judges to push my daughter's application forward. The rumors spread quickly, like dry gunpowder lit by a match. And what was worst of all, my daughter, having heard the whispers and strange looks of her classmates and their parents, began to withdraw into herself. She stopped picking up the books that she had looked at with trepidation just yesterday. I would go into her room and see the books that she had previously reached for every morning gathering dust on the table. And when I once asked her why she no longer read, she answered briefly, without looking up, "Why, if they think that I didn't do it myself?" This was the last straw. I could no longer put up with the fact that my child was suffering, that she had stopped believing in herself because of the malice and envy of an adult, whom even her own family could not protect. That night, when the house was quiet, I sat on the edge of the bed next to my husband and told him for the first time in detail about everything that had been going on since the beginning of our marriage, about the caustic remarks she had thrown at me like stones, about how she had taken away the clothes I had lovingly chosen for our newborn daughter, claiming that babies don't care what color they are, while not forgetting to laugh at me about my changing shape, calling me a sumo wrestler, jokingly, but in a way that doesn't make your cheeks burn with laughter. He was silent for a long time. Then he only whispered, "That's enough. That's too much." The next day he insisted on talking to his parents directly. I felt how he pulled himself together, how a wave of determination rose inside him that could no longer be stopped. He wanted to go to his sister himself, to a place where she felt safe and in power, to tell her everything as it was without intermediaries. When he came to her, she, according to him, was delighted at first, beaming from the unexpected visit, as if she were hoping for some kind of game of reconciliation. But when he spoke in a serious voice, without smiles or evasions, and laid everything out, her behavior, words, rumors, anger, to her face, she changed. The shock was almost physical, like a blow. And then came her reaction. She translated everything into accusations, sharply, defiantly, with anguish. She accused me of destroying their family, of separating her from her brother, of playing the victim, but in reality of betraying his trust. Her words were sharp, but he did not argue. He simply looked at her, and this silence was more eloquent than any scream. After that, her calls began. At first, I naively thought that she was trying to find a way to reconciliation, that perhaps her conscience had spoken. But soon it became clear, in each call there was not regret, but resentment, not remorse, but reproach, as if she did not understand why she was being reproached at all. Finally, when the calls became almost daily, not to talk, apologize, or just ask how things were, but to repeat the same accusations, reproaches, insults, which, as it seemed to me, no longer had any meaning or emotions left, except for an annoying emptiness, I set her number to forward to voicemail, allowing the receiver to remain silent and the air in the house to become cleaner, as if I had physically fenced myself off from this avalanche of discontent. I ignored her attempts to contact me, not because I wanted to ignite a conflict, but because I felt I was burned out, exhausted by the struggle, in which, no matter how hard I tried, I still remained a stranger. A few weeks later, the calls stopped, and I sighed with relief, deciding that she was simply tired, lost interest, switched to something else, as often happened with her outbursts of indignation. However, later, quite by chance, I learned that it was not a matter of her indifference at all. Everything became clear in December, when our in-laws organized a children's Christmas party, the first of its kind, and the news of it, I must admit, caused me mixed feelings. I was surprised not so much by the fact of the party itself, but by the fact that it was being planned for the first time, as if none of them had previously found any sense in such a gathering. But my daughter, seeing the invitation, literally lit up from within, and, remembering how much fun she had had at the Christmas party in kindergarten, she began to look forward to this day, hoping that the festive atmosphere would be repeated, especially since her elementary school did not have a tradition of holding such events due to a strict policy of neutrality towards religious holidays. I have often wondered how appropriate it is to cling to these formalities, since Christmas, whatever its roots, has long since become less a religious and more a cultural, unifying moment when people give each other warmth, light, and attention. I have often caught myself thinking about how strange it is to see some parents perceive the celebration as something threatening to their beliefs, forgetting that the holiday can simply be an excuse to be kinder. In the last 2 years, I have decided to celebrate Christmas in my own way, not according to someone else's canons, not according to strict instructions, but simply with love and joy in the house. My daughter and I organized cooking parties, baked gingerbread cookies, made garlands from paper, chose small gifts for each other. She especially loved the moment of exchanging gifts, the very moment when you give something of yourself to please someone else. When we received an invitation from my in-laws with a modest budget of $11 to participate in a holiday gift exchange, we took it as a challenge, not to spend more, but to find something special that would reflect warmth and personality. We headed to a nearby mall, where we spent the day searching for the perfect gift. My daughter picked out a picture book, one of her favorites, and said, "Mom, I want someone to read this and feel the way I do." Her desire to share something that brought her joy touched me deeply. On the day of the party, gift in hand, she took the bus to our in-laws' home just a few minutes away, and as we had arranged, she informed my mother-in-law in advance, who promised to meet her at the bus stop. Later, my mother-in-law called me and assured me that everything had gone well, that she had met the girl, and that she was already happily playing with other children. I felt calm. I even smiled, looking out the window, where the snow was slowly falling on the cornice, and for the first time in a long time I felt protected, but, alas, this feeling turned out to be an illusion. Just 50 minutes later, in the silence of a weekday, there was an unexpected creak of the front door opening, so inappropriate, so sharp that I, sitting at my laptop, working remotely, did not even immediately believe that it was not my imagination. My husband was at work, the house was empty, and when I went out into the hallway, I was met by a sight that made my heart clench. My daughter, sitting at the entrance, with tears on her cheeks, with trembling fingers, handed me a neatly wrapped, but slightly crumpled package, silently, only with her eyes, asking me to open it. I knelt down next to her, unwrapped the package, and froze. Inside was a newspaper that had once featured her photograph from a school project, now torn to shreds, and next to it was a card written in red ink, an ominous warning not to be too arrogant or we would end up like a scarecrow that, as it turned out, was also inside the bag, mutilated and covered in red liquid that simulated blood. This was not a child's prank. This was not a practical joke. This was a malicious, frightening message, meant to hurt, to frighten, to humiliate. Without looking up, the daughter whispered that her aunt, my sister-in-law, had done it. I had a hard time digesting the words, like stones on my tongue. The holiday, which should have been filled with children's laughter, an atmosphere of coziness and light, turned into a scene from a nightmare. I felt unbearably painful, for my daughter, for the girl who had chosen a gift with such enthusiasm, and believed that her kindness would be met with kindness in return, and not with cruelty wrapped in Christmas packaging. And even though I was not with her that evening, I still felt as if I had let her down. I was stunned to hear from my daughter not just about the incident, but that my daughter-in-law was behind it, a woman who, as I naively hoped, would eventually leave her bitterness in the past and stop looking for ways to cause harm through a child, but instead turned out to be capable of such a disgusting, unacceptable act. I looked at my daughter in disbelief, still shaking from the experience, and I could not immediately believe what I was hearing, because if my mother-in-law had known that her daughter was going to attend that party, and with such an intention, she would have certainly warned me. After all, she always emphasized how important it was for her that we report any problems or conflicts related to her daughter, not to hush up or ignore even the slightest suspicion. This breach of trust, this sudden and deliberate attack, carried out without my mother-in-law's knowledge, confused me, as if I were back in that first year of marriage, when a step to the left, a step to the right in her family was perceived as a challenge or a rebellion. After my daughter calmed down and recovered a little from the shock, I reminded her that her grandmother needed to know about what had happened, and that, no matter what, the truth had to be voiced. But just as she was about to take a breath to begin her story, my aunt, who was also there, I had no idea that she was also involved in organizing the party, intervened and abruptly declared that my daughter had not been invited because the event was exclusively for children attending missionary schools. My daughter looked up in amazement and asked with naive, genuine bewilderment, "Mom, what kind of missionary school is this?" A question to which I had no immediate answer, because I was also confused and did not immediately understand how these new boundaries and rules had appeared in our family, where everyone had always celebrated Christmas the same way, with smiles, food, and family hugs. It turned out that one of our relatives had recently been accepted into a missionary school, and this had caused a flurry of conversations, whispers, and even a little debate among family members, some supporting the choice, others, like me, preferring the more traditional path. My daughter-in-law's son, for example, was already attending a missionary preschool, and apparently that was something that was taken very seriously in their family. We chose the local preschool and the state primary school, not because we didn't care, but because we believed that it would enrich our daughter to grow up among children with different experiences, different views. But now it's clear that my daughter-in-law had turned that educational choice into another platform for humiliation, another way to make my daughter look like an outsider, like not fit. My heart was constricted with pain and anxiety, and without waiting for the fear to cool and dull, I grabbed my jacket, documents, and went to the nearest police station. I did not scream, did not cry, but my voice trembled as I insisted on the seriousness of the situation, showing the torn article and the creepy doll, still smelling of ink. And although at first the young officer tried to steer the conversation towards a family quarrel, saying that perhaps it would be better to settle it at home, a female officer intervened, attentive, with a tired but friendly look, and, having studied the package, said seriously, "This is not just a toy, this is intimidation. A threat. And it is subject to investigation." She recognized that such manifestations of aggression in the family deserved intervention, especially if there is a child in the center. She listened sympathetically to my story, asked a few clarifying questions, then stood up, took a copy of the statement and promised to visit my daughter-in-law in person with an official warning. That evening, when my husband returned home, I told him everything down to the last detail, showed him the contents of the package, relayed my words to my daughter, and saw a mixture of anger, shame, and helplessness flash in his eyes. He did not delay and immediately contacted his parents to tell them what had happened. They were shocked. They admitted that they had no idea about what had happened and insisted that no invitation had been sent to the daughter-in-law. According to them, she most likely entered through the back door, which was left unlocked while the mother-in-law was busy in the kitchen and did not keep an eye on who was coming and going. As it turned out, they had partially delegated the organization of the party to the discretion of the younger members of the family, which allowed the daughter-in-law to sneak in unnoticed. After the police officer gave my sister-in-law a formal warning about the possible legal consequences of her actions, the atmosphere in the family changed noticeably. The relatives became alarmed, realizing that the situation could no longer be hushed up or left unanswered, and suggested calling a family meeting to openly discuss what to do next. The meeting was arranged at my cousin's house, neutral territory, where everyone could feel on equal terms. My sister-in-law and her husband arrived last, clearly late. She entered with a displeased look, her mouth pressed tightly together and her eyes full of defiance. There was no remorse on her face, not a drop. She immediately declared that the police intervention was unnecessary and that I had turned childish stupidity into a drama. Her husband looked lost. He clearly did not know why he was called and kept looking around, as if hoping that someone would explain what was going on. This scene, her irritation, his confusion, showed the whole family how serious the problem was, how far it had gone, and that it was no longer possible to pretend that nothing had happened. At that moment, a real conversation began, not about trivialities, not about misunderstandings, but about deep, old cracks that had been ignored for years. When my sister-in-law's husband finally learned of her actions against our family, of her constant attempts to undermine trust, destroy peace and, ultimately, even intimidate the child, his shock was almost tangible. He looked as if the ground had slipped from under his feet, and each new fact spoken out loud seemed to add weight to his shoulders. He admitted that he had been completely unaware of the scale of the situation and had believed that the conflicts between us were nothing more than petty disagreements, as often happens between relatives, brothers' wives, or sisters by marriage. But, having listened to the story to the end, having seen those very gifts with his own eyes and having heard my daughter's trembling voice as she told us how it all happened, he silently lowered his eyes and, after a long, painful silence, asked us for forgiveness, quietly, reservedly, but sincerely, like a man who was ashamed not of his own actions, but of not noticing others. This impulse of his was in sharp contrast to the behavior of my daughter-in-law, who was still sitting with a face full of resentment and stubbornness, as if all this was an absurd mistake, a performance in which she turned out to be an innocent victim. When she, shrugging her shoulders, muttered that, since she was not arrested, it means she is not guilty of anything, the room froze. Even the most loyal relatives, who had doubted the extent of her guilt until the very end, could not find the words to justify such a level of denial. This moment became a turning point. And then, to everyone's surprise, her husband, the very man who seemed calm and reserved in everything, unexpectedly for us all announced that he had decided to divorce her. The room was silent, in which unspoken thoughts and sighs rang out. No one expected this, because outwardly their marriage seemed strong, even if without much tenderness. He explained that this decision was not spontaneous, but mature and hard one. He told how he had tolerated for years her growing coldness, her indifference to the house, to their son, to himself. How at first it had manifested itself in simple things, unmade breakfasts, forgotten parent-teacher conferences, in avoiding the slightest family responsibilities. Then, in an anxious obsession with appearance, in hours spent on self-care, not out of self-love, but out of a desire to maintain the illusion of a certain social status that existed only in her head. All these actions, he said, were never dictated by real need, only vanity, an attempt to establish herself among people who, frankly, did not care. He remembered how she tried to get her son into an elite private kindergarten, with fees that were beyond their budget, and how this project, like many others, ended in nothing, only disappointment and loss of face. In the end, the child went to a regular public primary school because he really liked it there, because it was where he felt comfortable, and it was his father who had insisted on this decision, against his wife's wishes. He emphasized that his choice to leave was not due to the latest incident alone, but was the culmination of years of resentment, dulled patience, and, finally, a furious awakening caused by her overt harassment and threats. Taken aback by this statement, my daughter-in-law tried to say something, to offer an apology that sounded so forced, so empty, as if she were repeating a memorized line just to turn the situation around. She began to assure everyone that it was just a joke, a prank, that she had not intended anything malicious in the message, that she had simply wanted to tease. But neither I, nor my husband, nor anyone else present could accept such an interpretation, not after everything, not after the fear in my daughter's eyes, not after the terrifying message that would have frightened an adult. This was not just bad taste, it was an act of aggression, behind which there was something dark, distorting the very essence of motherhood and kinship. I gathered my strength and said quietly, "You are a mother. But that does not make you a parent." And the room fell silent again. My husband, who had sat down next to me, looked at his sister and, seeing the tears streaming down her cheeks, said firmly, without malice, but also without pity, "Tears are not the answer. At your age, you should understand that remorse is not just crying. You cannot expect sympathy for what you have done." But she continued to cry. Her shoulders shook, her lips trembled, but there was no understanding in her words. She was simply asking why she was being blamed, why everyone was against her, when the real problem, in her view, was not her actions, but the fact that her brother had married an older woman. Asterisk, if you hadn't interfered with our family, she said, asterisk, everything would have been different. Her words were like a slap in the face, but the most striking thing was how sincerely she felt it, as if in her world it actually explained everything. Her inability to understand how destructive her behavior was, her stubborn denial, all of it silenced us. Even my husband, who had hoped until the very end that his sister would understand, was shocked, not by her actions, no, but by how far she had gone without realizing where the line was. In this oppressive atmosphere, the discussion ceased, not because we had said everything, but because we realized that there was no point in saying more. Her husband had no choice but to stand up, take her by the elbow, and, without saying a word, walk her out. The divorce proceedings began soon after, long, dark, complicated by her unwillingness to admit her mistakes and accept responsibility. The only glimmer of truth in the process was the innocent confession of their son, who, returning from school, with childish simplicity told her that at that very Christmas party his mother had dressed up so no one would recognize her, and left a present because it was more fun. This unconscious childhood truth became the final argument, quiet but crushing, and then she, realizing that everything had collapsed, finally gave in and gave her consent to the divorce. Her son, without wanting it and completely without malicious intent, became an involuntary source of truth that no one could ignore. At one of the classes he told his classmates about how at the Christmas party there was a strange gift, in which there was a stuffed animal, mutilated and covered in something red, like blood. The children, as often happens, perceived the story with growing interest and anxiety, and this story, like a spark caught by the wind, spread like lightning throughout the school community, penetrating into parent chats, reaching teachers, causing a justified concern that could no longer be calmed or hushed up. After this revelation, my daughter found it especially hard to return to school, not because anyone was directly accusing her, but because of the heavy air, filled with innuendo, whispers, and glances that suggested fear, wariness, or just plain stupid curiosity. Her spirit, already weakened by recent events, could hardly withstand the pressure, and each new day spent at home in silence seemed safer than the hallways filled with half-erased gossip. Speculation about why she had stopped going to school was intertwined with stories about the gift, attributing her part in something that had scared her to tears. One thoughtless act had set off a chain reaction that affected the lives of innocent children, showing how fragile reputations can be and how easily trust can be destroyed, especially when it comes to a child's vulnerability. I had hoped that this whole ordeal could be gradually exhausted, not forgotten, but lived through, outgrown, given the opportunity for my daughter to choose the moment of return, when her inner strength would once again take shape and gain strength. What is striking is that in this whole tragic situation, the intention of her cousin, a boy with a child's heart and an already adult understanding, to tell about what had happened was not a mischievous gesture or a desire to attract attention, but rather a plea, a desperate attempt to put an end to the actions of his own mother, who had crossed the boundaries of what was permitted and endangered the well-being of everyone around her. Having seen the consequences, having seen how his words affected public opinion, his father, my former brother-in-law, did not hesitate and accelerated the divorce process, agreeing to her conditions, if only to see it through to the end. By that time, Her name had become firmly associated in our community not with family or status, but with threats, with hostility directed at children, and this knowledge alienated even those who had previously refused to believe in her cruelty. Neighbors, once friendly, began to avoid her, to the point of open rejection, and, deprived of support, feeling like an outcast, she began to perceive the divorce itself as a release, as an escape, imagining that returning to her parents' home would give her a respite, peace, a place to lick her wounds. But everything turned out differently. Her husband's parents, who had remained patient and level-headed for so long, refused her entry. There was no malice in this decision, only weariness, a boundary she had crossed too many times. She was left alone. Alone in a world where her face no longer evoked sympathy, where neighbors turned away, where rumors became her shadow. Her situation deteriorated rapidly, her income disappeared, her debts piled up, her money came from dubious sources, and at some point she simply disappeared. The phones were silent, her social media was empty, and perhaps most astonishingly, no one close to her wanted to file a missing persons report. Her husband, her parents, even her son, all accepted her disappearance as perhaps the only possible ending, as the departure of someone who did not want to stay. And we returned to life. My daughter, step by step, reservedly, cautiously, but still began to return to school. She stayed close to her cousin, and there was a special bond in their eyes, an alliance of those who have been through a storm, who know how important it is to hold each other's hands. He promised to look after her, and I knew he would keep his word. They, the children, became stronger, kinder, wiser, and we, the adults, had to live up to them. This period, full of pain and doubt, unexpectedly strengthened us as a family. We began to have more heart-to-heart talks with each other, sharing our fears and plans. My former brother-in-law, now the only parent in his home, became closer, and a strong friendship developed between us, based not on memories but on a common goal, to protect and raise those who are most important to us. My husband's relatives, once hesitant, now fully accepted both grandchildren, both my daughter and my daughter-in-law's grandson, with all their hearts, tenderly, with concern, as if wanting to fill the void that her departure left. And most importantly, with her disappearance, the tension that had hung over our family for many years like a thundercloud went away. We no longer walked on tiptoe, did not expect a catch, did not live with an eye over our back. Laughter began to sound in our house again, books took their place on the bedside table again, and I felt how the same lightness that she had in childhood was awakening in my daughter, not carelessness, but trust, calmness, faith that everything can be survived if there is family nearby, if there is love nearby.